crime was so large that there's nothing we can do now. That is what they concluded. That yes, we committed a crime, but the crime is too large to settle. That was a conclusion in the British House of Commons and the British House of Lords. And I am in the balcony, no right to speak, but I want to shout and say, well, I can show you how to do it. Because you must start. Let me give you an example of the double standard. After the Second World War, when they had decimated millions of Jewish people and black people, and don't think for a moment, there's this mythology that only Jewish people were marched into the gas chambers of Hitler. There were Jews, blacks, and gypsies who were marched into those gas chambers. Our people were also marched into those gas chambers. There was an excellent exhibition at the Schomburg Center a few years ago, you can probably see it online, of images of African peoples being marched into Hitler's gas chambers. But the Jews tell their story, we don't tell our story. The Jews tell their story, and now the world believes that only Jews were marched into the gas chambers. But anyway, how were the Jews going to get justice? The Europeans constructed a court, the Nuremberg trials. And the first 2 days, the judges sat down at Nuremberg to work out a system to bring justice to the Jewish people. They made one admission. There is no precedent for this. It had never happened before. The court had no jurisprudence. There was no legal system. There was no precedent. How are you going to begin to compensate millions of people, millions of dollars for what has happened to them, and you have no legal process on which to go ahead? There was no law. It had never been done before. And the Nuremberg trials was about to collapse. The judges were dumbfounded. They didn't know how to proceed without legal precedent. And some of you here are lawyers, you can imagine how difficult that must have been, to proceed on something so major without precedent and case law. And as that panel of judges was about to collapse, one of them said, and I quote, one of them said, "We are asked to walk into the desert. We know that somewhere in that desert there is water. We have no idea where that oasis is, but let us bravely walk into the desert until we find it." On that basis, the judges at Nuremberg started to find and to devise law in which to compensate the Jewish people. And those who say that there is no law, no case law to compensate the African peoples who have gone through this journey, I would just quote what they said to themselves at Nuremberg. Walk into the desert until you find the water. Walk into it. Because, and I'm coming to an end. Without justice, there will always be perpetual terrorism. The world today, each of you turn on your television, and all you hear about is terrorism. Every day, every moment. Can any of you imagine a greater terrorism than what has happened to African peoples? There was no greater terrorism. Let me give you an example of how the terrorism comes home to each of us. As you heard, I'm the Vice Chancellor of the University of the West Indies. All of our 3 landed campuses are built on slave plantations. Our campuses are all built on lands where enslaved Africans worked and died. A few years ago, we were building the new medical faculty at our Mona campus. The Chinese company won the contract. They came on the site, the surveyors, all there, the bulldozers started to do their work. And as the bulldozers began to create the foundation, all of these bones began to come up from the ground. The bones began to come up from the ground. Because we did not know, no one knew, that that was where the slave plantation cemetery was located. That is where the Africans who died on the plantation were thrown into mass graves, right on that site. So our ancestors were coming out of the ground, talking to us. I believe in the spiritual dimension, they were talking to us. I believe they were saying to us, educated leaders, do not forget us. They were saying to us, do not forget us. So we took the bones out, we took them all. We had a ceremony. We did what we had to do. And then we placed some monument. But even more chilling is what happened at the Cave Hill campus. We were celebrating the 50th anniversary of the campus, went to the archives to do some historical research on the history of the campus. My distinguished colleague, Professor Woodward Marshall, wrote a remarkable study of the history of the land that is now the campus. The intersection of 2 cotton plantations, 1 sugar plantation, all of that was there historically. Our campus is built on top of that. On top of that history of slavery, a campus is built. And we discovered through that historical research our first teacher at the Cave Hill campus. How do we find it? 1796. The year is 1796. A slave ship pulled up in Bridgetown Harbor. And on that slave ship is a 3-year-old boy whose name is Quaw. His parents had been killed in the raid on their village, and all the babies that were left crying and screaming as their parents were killed, the slave raiders picked up the children and put them on a slave ship. And young Quaw arrived at Bridgetown Harbor, 3 years old, and was bought by the owner of the plantation that was at now the heart of where my campus is. And he brought the child because he had a 3-year-old son and wanted a toy to play with his son. And so he bought Quaw. Quaw grew up on that site. Now, the narrative of Quaw is there in the documentation. Through some phenomenal gift of God, Quaw is able to teach himself to read. The slave owner recognized that this child has special intellectual gifts. Special gifts. And so he reads, he writes, and so on. Quaw enters into emancipation in 1833, so this is now 30-something years later, and Quaw is conducting Sunday school on a chapel built on the plantation. Because the decision was taken to Christianize the slaves, to Christianize them quick, before emancipation. Before that, to practice Christianity was bad news. They passed an anti-obey act. Then they said, Christianize them quick. So they built a small chapel on the plantation. And Quor is told that he must teach Sunday school every Sunday to the little slave children. Emancipation comes, the English Anglican Church knocks down the chapel and builds a proper church on the site, St. Stephen's Church on the periphery of the estate. Big, beautiful church. Quor becomes the sexton of the church. The first black sexton of an Anglican church anywhere in the world. But he dies in the 1854 cholera epidemic. Well, on his deathbed, he is telling his narrative. And he's speaking about his parents, his journey, his life as a slave, and so on. But he says, I found a beautiful woman, I got married, I have 4 daughters, I have rebuilt my life, I found love, found this, and he tells his story. But Quor becomes our first teacher on the Cayfield campus site. So now Cayfield campus has a monument which is called Quor's Quest, dedicated to the first teacher on that site, who entered that site as a 3-year-old slave. Now, all of us have to treat with this history every single day. Just 2 weeks ago, 3 weeks ago, we were at Harvard University. We were able to persuade our colleagues at Harvard to organize a conference of all universities that were built on slavery, by slaves, on slave plantations, or had received endowment from slave owners. There were 150 of us vice chancellors and principals and professors at Harvard, all of us from universities that were built on slave plantations, by slave owners, and with slave labor in the universities. So now, Harvard, and many of you might not know this, but Harvard Law School, arguably the most famous law school in the world, was built on an endowment presented by an Antiguan slave owner. Antiguan slave owner moves to Boston, makes a donation of cash and land to start the Harvard Law School. Now, at Harvard, they had dormitories where the slaves would carry the books for their masters and mistresses. So you are a student, but you have your own slaves walking with you to the classrooms carrying your books. And there was a dormitory at the back where the slaves will be washing the clothes of the students who are their masters in between classes. So imagine the privilege you would have as you go from classroom to classroom. Your slave is waiting for you outside your class to carry your bag to your next class. And after you play games, to take your clothes and wash them, hang them up to dry, press them and give them to you, so you go off to school the next day. This was how Harvard started, with slaves, hundreds of slaves, living on the campuses, taking care of the students who are their masters. Georgetown University, you would have heard, Georgetown ran into financial difficulty. 1860s, financial difficulty. No problem. The president called a meeting with his bursar, and they decided to liquidate some assets to raise some cash. Sell off 200 slaves to raise some cash. Because on the books of the university are hundreds of slaves' assets. And so they sold 200, raised some cash to expand the campus and to modernize it. That is the history that all of us are now treated with across this hemisphere. And so we are also saying universities for reparations. We are now forming a network, universities for reparations. Because Universities cannot only be excellent. Universities also have to be ethical. And you cannot be excellent unless you're ethical. You begin with your ethical soul and spirit in the journey to being excellent. All those universities are now trying to find a way to establish their moral authority in this 21st century because of the history from whence they came. So this movement of reparatory justice is not only for us in our communities. It's for our universities. It's for our governments. It's for our NGOs. This world in this 21st century will only know justice when this matter is dealt with. And all of us around the world are standing our ground. I believe that this is the first time that all Caribbean peoples will be presented with enough historical evidence and truth to make a contribution to this movement. And it will begin with an apology. Prime Minister of Britain, of France, all of them, Spain, Portugal, have all refused to give an apology. But instead, they issue what they call a statement of regret. And for those of you who are not sure of the distinction between an apology and a statement of regret, let me share this with you. If I walk off this podium now and step on the foot of my Rastafarian brethren, he goes home, his foot swells up, he has a diabetic wound. His diabetic wound does not heal. He might have to have his foot amputated. His life is changed forever. Now, I can come to him and say, my brother, I'm issuing you a statement of regret. A statement of regret says, between you and me, boy, I'm sorry. No, go and disappear. Sorry, but that's the end of that. Go. And that is what the Prime Minister of Britain and all the other Prime Ministers said. A statement of regret. Sorry, now go. An apology is a very different concept. An apology says, my brother, I'm sorry. You have medical bills. I will pay you my just share of your medical costs. You will not be able to work for the next 15 years because you have lost your productive capacity. I will compensate you the best I can for the loss of your productive years. That is what an apology is. It admits responsibility. It admits and it takes responsibility for the consequences. A statement of regret does not take responsibility, does not admit accountability. It expresses a moral view, closes the chapter, and walk away. Anytime you hear someone issue a statement of regret, you say to them, no, 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 no. No, I do not need your statement of regret. I need your apology. Because the harm that you have caused, you must participate in healing the harm that you have caused. In other words, you must help to repair the damage you have done. Reparations mean I will repair to the best of my ability the damage I have done. Now, I can very well say to you, with all the prejudices of Western history, I can say, well, he's only a black man, I don't have to apologize to no black man, he's not worth it. Black people have low self-esteem, they are the lowest ebb on the world's pole. I will not demean myself by apologizing to him. He has no value. Black people have no value. You're low level. So take the regret and go. That is where we are in the world today. All of us, that's where we are in the world today. Now, the question is whether we accept that perception of us and allow this process to be brushed under the carpet, or do we say no? As Pompey said in these Bahamas in 1830, I am tired of being treated as property. I am a human being, I'm not moving. No, this is wrong. Your Pompey did that. Your Robert Love did that in these islands. Stood his ground, went to Jamaica and became the greatest Pan-Africanist of the end of the 19th century. Standing for dignity. This country has a long tradition of standing up for these causes. So I say to you this evening, I thank you for the generosity of your patience. This has been a long conversation, and for those of you who found it far too long, I give you my sincere apology.
Indeed, not long enough, some of us would think. History is an often painful subject to enter. I have occasion in teaching my advanced composition class to study articles that deal with Bahamian history, the wider Caribbean history. And oftentimes students come very reluctantly to such texts. It's painful, it's intense. It deals with issues that they have submerged, they would rather not talk about. And so I think Sir Hilary Beckles has given us quite a treat, food for thought. Disturbing in some respects, very intense. I saw many people with, having a visceral, sort of very visible emotional response to some of the anecdotal aspects that Sir Hilary shared with us. I'm certain that some of you may have some questions, and Sir Hilary has graciously agreed to accept some questions. There's one microphone to my right, if there are any persons with questions at this time.
Sir Hilary, great presentation. I'm not sure if I heard, was that a statement of regret or an apology for the speech?
That was an apology.
Now, when it comes to trying to figure out what's the cost of the reparations, obviously global GDP is about 75 trillion. What percentage of that should we be thinking about if we're thinking about this in the context of global crimes?
Okay. As I said, when the judges sat down at Nuremberg to work through how to develop a methodology for the compensation of the Jewish people, it took them a while to work this out. There were competing models and concepts. But they eventually found something that the United Nations, or then the League, they found something that was acceptable globally. Now, to begin to work through a compensatory model is going to be equally complicated. The CARICOM Commission has established a 10-point plan that could frame the conversation. The 10-point plan, reparations plan, said the first item is that there has to be an apology to the African peoples for these crimes committed against them. That is the first thing that must be done. The second thing is the repatriation of all Africans who wish to go back to Africa. The African peoples are stolen people. If you are in the business of stealing people, you have a duty to return stolen people from whence they came. There are at the moment 15 African countries that have agreed to accept Africans from this part of the world who wish to return. I was over in Ethiopia about 6 months ago in Shashamani, where there are now some 30,000 Caribbean folks who have returned and who are living in Shashamani and reconstructing and rebuilding their lives all over the Caribbean. Now, Senegal, Gambia, South Africa, Ghana, especially, have all agreed to do so. There are some challenges, but nothing happens without good, effective planning. So, the European governments and all those governments who stole the African peoples would have to work through a resettlement plan and strategy to finance and settle those who wish to go back. The third issue relates to the public health of African peoples. Now, all of you know that the global image we have as Caribbean peoples, as Caribbean black people, we have an image of being athletic. Because the world watches Usain Bolt and all of the great Bohemian athletes. They watch us and they say, wow, those Caribbean people are fit. But the fact is that if you take the criterion, the marker of chronic diseases, hypertension, type 2 diabetes, that are running rampant through Caribbean black people, the black people in the Caribbean, using the marker of chronic diseases, we are the sickest people in the world. Now, that is not an exaggeration. We are the sickest people in the world. Over 60% of all black people in the Caribbean over the age of 60 have hypertension, diabetes, either or both. And it is expanding at a phenomenal rate. Now, some people might wish to try to explain why this is so. But the historians, oftentimes, the historians and the medics, we have different views. I know the medics, there's a medical view that says, well, we have shifted our lifestyles in the last 20, 30 years. Shifted our lifestyles, all the junk food, not enough exercise and so on, we have shifted that, and this is responsible for this rapid expansion of chronic diseases that's crippling our communities. Historians have a different view. We say, if you take a people for 300 years and you lock them up on small islands and you brutalize them, overwork them, underfeed, psychologically terrorize them, sell their children, rape their wives, and you take them through that journey for 300 years, and each day you give them salt fish and salt meat to eat, in the midst of that psychological act of terror, you give them salt fish and salt pork every single day for 300 years, and now they cannot metabolize salt and sugar. Why are you surprised that we cannot metabolize salt and sugar? Because that's all we had. On the sugar plantations, the slaves were told, eat what you grow. And if you're planting sugar, you eat sugar. I grew up on a sugar plantation in Barbados. My parents were agricultural workers on a sugar plantation. My grandparents were agricultural laborers on a sugar plantation, all the way back to slavery. So as a child, I lived on a sugar plantation. And when I was going to primary school, you know, there was never enough food. We were given a bag of sugar to walk to school. And you would walk to school with half a pound of sugar. And when the hunger gripped you, you would just eat handfuls of sugar. That is what we grew up on in Barbados, as working class black kids, eating sugar as a meal. It is not surprising, therefore, that Barbados has the highest diabetes rate among adults in the world. It is not surprising. It is not surprising at all. It is not surprising that Barbados is called the amputation capital of the world, because they are the sickest people in the world when it comes to diabetes. It has to do with the history and the journey. Now, who is going to help to clean up all of that? And I will tell you this: if you examine the drugs that are used on black people who have hypertension, and there are a handful of them, the responses of Caribbean black people to to those drugs is very suppressed. The same drugs that will give white people a 90 to 95% good response would give us a 60 to 65 response. Now, the remarkable thing is that the pharmaceutical companies are not going to invest millions of dollars to develop hypertension drugs specifically designed for African Caribbean peoples. Why? Because the Africans in Africa have the same good response as the Europeans. So the question therefore is, if you have a hypertension drug and a person in England takes it and has a good response, and the African in Nigeria and Ghana also has a very good response, well, the handful of people in the Caribbean who have a terrible response because something has happened to us over the 300 years that we have been modified away from our ancestral pool. So I sit next to my brother from Nigeria or Ghana. So I'm here from Barbados. The three of us have hypertension. My Nigerian brother, he's good. The drug works on him. My Ghanaian brother, he's good. It works on him. It doesn't work on me. And I am from the same gene pool as these two people because something happened to us in the Caribbean during the slavery. Who is going to pay for all of that that biochemistry research? We have approached the pharmaceutical companies to say that there are only about 7 or 8 million black people. We're not going to spend billions to solve your problem. If it was an African problem, we would spend the money and make a fortune in Africa, but it's your problem. So we go right through issues of technology transfer, research facilities. These and such like events constitute the totality of what we're speaking about. Now, no one that I'm aware of in the Caribbean have said that we need to discuss reparations as a cash handout. For us on the CARICOM Reparations Commission, reparations is a development strategy. It is a plan for the development of Caribbean people and Caribbean society. Now, there are many people who says, no, it has to be more than that. Some people have said, no, we want cash, we want money, we have to be compensated financially for what has happened to our ancestors. I do not have a quarrel with anyone who says that. What I will say to you is that the CARICOM Commission is speaking about reparatory justice as a development strategy for Caribbean people to put us as far ahead as we can be humanly possible given what has happened to us. When I was in high school, in the UK, that was interesting because my parents were part of that 1950s labor migration to Britain to go and work in the British factories. So let's assume that's a cycle. From Africa to the Caribbean, from the Caribbean back to England, always being moved around the world as cheap labor. Okay? In Britain, there are about 7 or 8 museums to African slavery. So the school children can go to visit these beautiful interactive museums, and there isn't one in the Caribbean. No school teacher in the Caribbean can take a class of kids and take them to a museum to take them through the history of their people. But there's one in Manchester, in Liverpool, in Birmingham, they're all over England. But who is going to pay for that in the Caribbean? Not the British. The British has to take care of all of that issue. So, am I going to ask the government of the Bahamas to set aside $30 million to build a slavery museum when it has other problems to deal with in health, education, and so on? These are things that are practical, and these are things that are real. So the Reparations Commission is very clear. These educational infrastructures must be funded by the British government across the Caribbean. And we can go on and on and on. So the 10-point plan that sets out the model for reparations as development. But on the cash point, simply put, a group of British economists and accountants did a quantitative study of how much Britain owes the Caribbean black people. And how they calculated it was as follows. Britain enslaved 6 million African people in the Caribbean. If Britain was to pay each of those 6 million persons it enslaved 6 pence a day for the work they gave, and 6 pence was calculated on the basis of what Britain paid the lowest workers in Britain. The lowest paid worker in Britain was an agricultural field hand. And the agricultural field hand in the 18th century and 19th century were being paid between 6 and 8 pence per day. Take that same payment that was paid to the British worker in the agricultural sector and transfer that across to pay the African people who did the same work. Then you add on top of that a 10% for damages and psychological torture, which is the methodology of damage calculation. They came up with a figure. They came up with a figure of £9 trillion. Now, Britain would have to find £9 trillion to pay the Caribbean workers. £9 trillion would be the back pay that they, and that was done by the City of London financial analysts who did that exercise. They would have to pay £9 trillion. Now, the British GDP is not £9 trillion. In other words, they will have to find more than what they have now if you use that methodology. So I say, as the judges say at Nuremberg, sit down and work out a development plan and a development strategy for the Caribbean that is reasonable and that we in the Caribbean can accept as acceptable going forward. But it has to be done in an orderly and scientific way.
Necessarily doubt whether reparations will come to pass, but who feel that we don't deserve reparations or that reparations is a futile exercise, especially considering the fact that our governments in the Caribbean seem to be irresponsible in managing the resources and monies that they have available to them currently. So how do you address people who argue against reparations, period?
Yes, there is an argument which you hear across the Caribbean that says, the three arguments. Whatever happened in the past, forget it, let's move on. I've heard that in the Caribbean. That's the standard view you hear in Europe, but it's always surprising when you also hear it in the Caribbean. There's a view which says that we in the Caribbean are poor, not because of what happened during the historical periods or what happened up to the 1960s. We are poor because our governments have mismanaged the resources that are available to us right now. I've heard that point of view. And then there's a view which also said that we have to stop looking back, we must look forward. Now, these are all the views that you hear in England, in France, in Spain, in Portugal, and you get accustomed to hearing them in Europe. Now, when I hear those arguments in Europe, the first thing I think is, well, you know, it is always so easy to blame the victim. You know, black businesses do not succeed because blacks are not entrepreneurial. Blacks have high unemployment because blacks are lazy. Blacks have high diabetes and hypertension because black people eat any rubbish and enjoy eating it. And all of that has nothing to do with the circumstances. No one take the time out to look at the circumstances that enable people to do what they do. I mean, this explosion of soft drinks in the Caribbean where the Caribbean kids are now addicted to these sodas. And it's an addiction right across the region. Now, you can very well say, well, the parents give them pocket money, and the first thing they do, they run to the store and buy a soda with 50 grams of sugar. And then they're obese and so on. But how is it that all of these children in the whole Caribbean have become like that? It isn't that they're crazy, it is that it has become a culture historically brought down through time. It is now common sense. And I will give you an example of that. When I was 9 years old, I did my common entrance. What do you call it here? Common entrance? Common entrance, what do you call it? Yeah. I did my common entrance. And the primary school teacher came to the village and told my grandmother, Mrs. King, your grandson has passed his common entrance. Well done. My grandmother called me, gave me a kiss, and gave me 25 cents. Right? And I ran straight to the store and bought 2 sodas. I will never forget it. I rushed to the store and bought 2 sodas. 1 orange and 1 red. And I drank the orange one and then drank the red one. And my stomach was filled with 2 sodas at the age of 9. Because that was the culture. We were all doing it. Now, don't blame the victim. So I say to that, take your share of blame for your problems. Take your share of the blame. But in this instance that we are dealing with, a significant part of this, the responsibility lies elsewhere. So those who are also responsible must join with you and collectively remove and solve the problem. I am not suggesting that we Caribbean people must not be held accountable for our mismanagement and our attitudes towards each other and so on. We have to take our share. But those persons who have other responsibilities must also come and participate. So reparations for me is really about the collaboration of joint responsibility and joint accountability.
All right, Amen. As you have said, this has been a struggle against slavery all of these years, or on Ma'afa all of these years, and nothing has ever been handed to us as African people. We've always resisted. Europeans still control the ideological framework that we operate in. They still and by that they still control our emotions, our perceptions. And so therefore, the old model of burning the plantation might not work so well today to get their attention. So what sort of force, what sort of power, because a lot of the work that goes on around reparations are focused on contextualizing, which is very important, not only for reaping the reward of our own personal development, but there has to be some level of force. You have to force their hand in some way. So how does the whole reparation of national commissions, university commissions propose that we develop this power to force the hand, so to speak?
When the European governments were passing their emancipation legislation, the enslaved people were saying, what about compensation for us? Even when the British Parliament was debating compensation for the slave owners, the black people in the Caribbean were saying, what about compensation for us? So the reparations movement was started by the enslaved people themselves, who were pushing for compensation. We have the records of the British Parliament responding to us. In the debate in 1834, one of the members of the House of Commons actually said that the African people in the Caribbean have the nerve and the audacity to ask for compensation. We are freeing them, that is the compensation. We are giving them the freedom, that is the compensation. Because we can enslave them forever. Now, that was the response to the black people in the Caribbean who were saying, what about reparations for us right now? So that was shot down. For the next 150 years, black people all across the Caribbean were demanding compensation. Compensation. On the 50th anniversary of emancipation, there were celebrations all across the Caribbean calling for compensation. On the 100th anniversary of emancipation in 1838, there were speeches and lectures delivered by black people all across the Caribbean calling for reparations. The civil society were building that movement for 150 years. All that has happened in the last few years when the CARICOM Reparations Commission was established is that finally, governments came on board. Governments came on board to join with the people who have been demanding this for 150 years. And it was not easy for governments to join with the people, because the Pan-Africanists, the Rastafari, all of these people have been carrying this movement on their backs for 100 years. The governments have now come on board and they have said, okay, now we will now join forces with the people. Now, what we have to determine is where it's going to go from here. I can share with you that CARICOM has written a letter, a formal official letter, to all of the slave-owning, enriching governments of Europe calling for a summit to discuss this. And that letter went out to the governments of Britain, Spain, Portugal, the Netherlands, Sweden, Norway, Denmark, I hope I'm not missing any. All of France, Belgium, all of those governments received a letter from the heads of CARICOM inviting them to a summit to discuss reparations for the people of the Caribbean. We are waiting for all of those responses to come. Some of them have responded, not all of them have responded. But this is a historic moment. Now, let's assume they all says, well, you Caribbean folks forget it. The question is, what do we do next? Let's assume that some of them said, okay, let's have a conversation, let's talk about it. What do we do? So we are at a moment in time where we have to work through what our next step is going to be. But there's also the International Criminal Court. There's also the International Criminal Court, where crimes against humanity are adjudicated. So we have moved a considerable distance in the last 5 years. There will always be other steps to be taken, but collectively, all of us in this movement will have to decide strategically what our next steps are going to be after this historic step has been taken.
Understanding that the collective reparations plan isn't about cash payouts, right? Isn't it important to acknowledge, though, that we currently are operating under the same accounting and economic systems that existed back then? And until we deconstruct that and start afresh, what effect will a national development strategy have if we still have an unlevel playing field? And while cash payouts are important, shouldn't we acknowledge that countries like Britain and people like David Cameron's father continue to use these islands to hide the money that they tell us is not available to pay us? And then the third point is, as a part of the CARICOM committee, could we think about recommending the creation of ministries of decolonization in our CARICOM states to center these processes and move these processes through? We see in South America, our Latin brothers and sisters, at least in Bolivia, have already begun to establish structures like these to deal with these sorts of processes.
And these are the fundamental questions. And allow me to say this. The members of the CARICOM Commission are very aware that only a few of the answers can actually exist on the Commission. The Commission does not see itself as speaking for all Caribbean peoples because there is a diversity of opinion and a diversity of views on this matter. Now, it's impossible for any commission to carry that diversity of thought. So we do not see ourselves as representing the people of the Caribbean. We see ourselves as representing some of the views of the people of the Caribbean, and not all of the views of the people of the Caribbean. So we are always looking for the people to say, listen, this is not enough, this is wrong, you have to go much further, because that is how you build momentum. And sometimes I do believe that the people of the region have clearer and stronger and more diverse views than those who on the Commission. Now, when Cameron came to Jamaica, and civil society said to him, well, welcome home, but let's discuss this legacy. He made a statement that since no British Prime Minister has been to the region for 40 years, and it is true we have turned our backs and we have neglected you, and he apologized for neglecting and all blah, blah, blah. But I will make a financial commitment. He said, I will not call it reparations. And then some people said, well, if you're not going to call it reparations, what are you going to call it? We don't want your aid. We don't want aid. We want development support, and we want reparations. So, with respect to Mr. Cameron, he went back to England, and he did make arrangements, and £300 million were sent to the Caribbean Development Bank to support infrastructure in the region. Now, the £300 million arrived at the CDB. The governments have applied for this money for infrastructure. I believe that Barbados and the Bahamas were not included because under British calculations, we are seen as middle-income countries. So I understand that Barbados, Bahamas were excluded from being able to draw down on any of that £300 million. So it is going mostly to the Windward Islands, the Leeward Islands, Guyana. Trinidad is not included either. Now, clearly what you're seeing there is what you call someone throw pennies at you and say, take the pennies and go away. Take the pennies and go.
They burst you with the pennies because it's Cameron's daddy's money that's inflated in economic figures, why we can't qualify for that money anyway.
There you go. So you see the problem with the money and with this notion of take something and keep quiet. Now, but the bigger point you're making is that the language that was used, which was read as the mandate of the Commission, spoke about the crimes that were committed primarily against indigenous people, slavery, but it does not focus on colonization up to the present moment as a crime. There are still colonies in the Caribbean. Colonization is still a feature of the Caribbean. There's nothing I hate more in my life than when I jump on an airplane and I fly 20 minutes to Martinique, 20 minutes from Barbados to Martinique, and I see a sign at the airport, welcome to France. And as a Caribbean educator, I have to accept welcome to France on an island that is my neighboring island. Welcome to France. There are still colonies in our world, our Caribbean world. That is a criminal act to maintain people in colonial degradation. Now, how do we expand the reparatory justice process around the crimes of colonization into the present moment that many of our people are forced to live in? And of course, the colonizer then says, well, if we have a referendum, those people in those islands will vote to stay colonized. But that is the nature of colonization. The nature of colonization is that it forces the colonized to feel inferior, dependent, useless, and self-hating. That is the purpose of colonization. You are supposed to behave like that after you have been colonized for a few hundred years. You're supposed to hate the notion of self-responsibility. You're supposed to hate the color of your skin. You're supposed to hate the hair of your children. You're supposed to be very upset when your child marries someone who's darker than your child. These are the things you are supposed to hate, because that is the objective of colonization. So yes, we now have to treat with colonization in our time right now.
Thank you very much. I have one question really for CARICOM. And the fact that you say the plan is the strategic intention is the development of the Caribbean and places of the Caribbean. But I'd like to find out what is the intention or what is the plan to continue this kind of process of educating Caribbean people at the most basic level of understanding our history. And I'm not just talking about history taught in the school, but this kind of presentation that you made this evening that gives us a very good sense of what reparations are all about and what it is for. When I watched you the other day, in your very interesting dialogue with the panel of three, which included the Minister of Justice, the French Minister of Justice.
Yes, the Harvard
Conference. Yes, the Harvard Conference. And she was making an excellent point as well, that in her situation in France, they don't know. It's a remote thing for them, what happened. Their role in slavery and the enslavement of people and how their wealth was created. We have created 400 years of wealth for all of Europe based on wage work. I think people need to understand that, not only at the level of that she described, which is to educate French people, English people, and so on, to know how they came to have the wealth they have enjoyed, and the development that they know, and that has placed them in the so-called first world and created what is a so-called third world. But we of this world, this Caribbean world, need to have an understanding of what we're trying to achieve in this 21st century, in the journey towards real liberation and freedom. And we're in a world now where the whole process of globalization has gone into yet another level, another dispensation we're going through. And this dispensation is fierce as the one we came through, or are still going through, but has taken on even more devastating consequences on the long term. And everybody is sort of caught up in what's going on with this new form of terrorism, almost forgetting that the terrorism we've experienced is not over. So what does CARICOM intend to do to truly get people on board? Because it can't just be an intellectual engagement of understanding what happened to us historically. But what are we going to do to really change things, given where we are now, given the fact that one set of people, one part of the world, has been able to do their development on our backs, on our sweat, the sweat of our ancestors, and we cannot catch up.
Yeah.
What does CARICOM plan to do to educate us in that regard?
Well, I would share with you that
who are corrupt could be prosecuted because they're against the law. See, if they are corrupt, now the problem is, if the government is doing it, the Attorney General has got to do the proceedings.